All right, so have you ever heard of the petrodollar? In 1974, Saudi Arabia agreed to sell all oil exports via the U.S. dollar in exchange for U.S. military security in the region, with obvious stipulations, of course. But as of last night, Saudi Arabia allowed the petrodollar pact to expire and will now be selling oil in other currencies, including the Chinese yen. Weird. Now, Saudi Arabia exports $1 billion a day in oil, and the U.S. currency is no longer that standard. Look, folks, I warned you about this 3 years ago, about the rise of the BRICS countries and that currency that want to diminish America's power. And if the U.S. dollar loses its standard as the global currency, guess what? We can't print our own money anymore. Well, I mean, we could, but it would be useless, and we become Venezuela, where you need a wheelbarrow full of cash to buy a loaf of bread. I'm not kidding. The world trusts our currency because it was stable, because of generations of presidents through treaties and exchanges in defense of our allies agreed to trade on the value of our dollar and our dollar alone. But when you print $7 trillion in the last 3.5 years and don't have an economy to back it up, nations forego our national defense to have other allies. This is bad. This is very bad. It's becoming increasingly obvious that our enemies, like China and Russia, and those who side with them, like now Saudi Arabia apparently, are controlling most of the global resources now, folks. While we fumble around building 7 EV charging stations for $8 billion and giant stupid fans to just filter carbon, which trees do an even better job, just because some autistic Swedish high school dropout said, "How dare you?" Priorities, people. Hillary Fordwich, president of Stelmark LLC, and economist John Jordan. Hillary, what do you make of this?
Well, you're absolutely right, Carl. And when you talk about the BRICS countries, I always say to people, no, obviously that's Brazil, Russia, Iran, China, South Africa. Do any of those sound like our close friends? No. And actually, you're totally and utterly right. What this is Saudi Arabia made this pact. It was actually talked about 60 years ago, 1944, towards the end of the Second World War. And this was Roosevelt. And after that, then it actually went into place 50 years ago. The agreement was signed. And don't forget that Nixon was very involved in this. And it was actually Henry Kissinger that Machiavellianly managed to make sure that Saudi Arabia was on our side, despite us being a friend of Israel. He was very clever about that. So now, what does this mean? You know what this means to our viewer? What does this mean to the American public? Eventually, this will mean higher inflation because it will be far more costly when the dollar is no longer a global currency. That will affect every American and every American's pocketbook.
John?
Yeah, there's another dimension to Carl as well, and that is it's going to affect interest rates. When the dollar was the dominant world's reserve currency, for example, Saudi Arabia had $750 billion worth of treasuries. When these countries start to dump treasuries because they don't have to pay in dollars anymore, that's going to make it harder for the federal government to finance these deficits, and it's going to drive up interest rates. Everybody thinks that interest rates are purely the province of the Federal Reserve. They're not. Interest rates are the price of money, and they're determined by market forces, supply and demand. And when there's no more demand for dollars, you're going to find it harder for the Treasury Department to sell the ubiquitous T-bill. And that's going to drive interest rates for Americans everywhere.
Yeah, well, that's the problem, too, is we have Hillary, and I got less than a minute left, is 6-7% yields on short-term bonds right now. That's going to go up, but so are the price of everything.
No, the price of everything will go up. And also, I mean, obviously, this is a minor issue. Well, the major issue is geopolitical stability. This is going to be very destabilizing for the world. But the other issue, maybe it sounds minor, but when Americans travel abroad, your dollar will be far weaker. You will not be able to have such a great vacation. Minor issue compared to global stability, but still an American issue.
Yeah, John, last 30 seconds to you.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's a bigger problem in the Middle East. The Chinese are trying to secure their energy resources, and they don't really have the ability to make their own energy, so they have to depend on Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states to do that. And they're building military bases there, and they're becoming ever more politically influential in the region at the expense of the United States. And this is now long-term national security for us and for our allies.
Yeah, and imagine if we would just drill for more oil than anybody else, which we have domestically, we could recontrol a lot of those supply channels. Hillary Fordwich, John Jordan.
And last but not least, Carl, in Africa, all the precious metals like iridium that we use in cell phones and everything, that's being dominated by China too. They're taking over.
Yeah. All right. Got to leave it there. Thanks, guys. All right. Coming up, Spotify is apparently worried about keeping the